Hey everyone, this is Andrew, and in this video I'm going to go over compression and how it applies to mixing your music. So a compressor is basically a plugin or a piece of actual hardware that you use that allows you to set a certain threshold value, and then you're going to have some signal that's getting put through the compressor, and anything above that threshold value is going to get compressed or squished down to a certain degree. And you're going to be able to control how much it's squished down, what that threshold level is, how fast the compressor kicks in, and how slow it releases. So if we take a look at my screen here, I have just a stock plugin from Logic here, and this is just kind of a stereotypical compressor. So we have our threshold, which allows us to set that value above which that we want to compress our signal. It has a ratio, which allows us to set the degree that that audio signal is going to be compressed over our threshold. It allows us to set some gain just in case our signal gets too compressed or not, or if it gets drastically quiet or louder. We can adjust for that. It allows us to set an attack, which has how fast the compressor acts, and a release, which is how fast or slow the compressor lets go after the signal gets below the threshold. So I'm just going to play some music and show you the parameters on the compressor. It's not going to be recording the audio. I just want to show you what the compressor is actually doing and how changing the effects actually relates to what the compressor is doing. So let's go. Alright, so I have some music playing now, and I'm going to make my compressor have a very high threshold value. So you can see here in this plot to the right, it's not actually doing anything. The white line that pops down is what's actually being compressed, and this gray jaggedy stuff is my actual signal. And I can change the degree at which this is being compressed. First I'm going to make the threshold a little lower down just to make this more obvious. So now the compressor is really driving. It's compressing by about minus 10 dB. If I change my ratio down to like 1, it's not compressing very much. Just because the audio that's going above the signal, I'm only telling it to compress it by a factor of 1.4. So let's say, for example, I make the ratio a value of 2. If the value above my threshold value is going over by 4 decibels, then that's going to be compressed down to 2 decibels. Over, at least. Decibels seem to work in negative numbers because it's all based on the scale, but besides the point, if I was to make this 5 and I was going 10 decibels over, then it's going to scale it down to 2. So you can see how much of an effect that can make on the total dynamic level of your track. If you're scaling anything over a certain point by a factor of 5, then now you have a much narrower window of dynamics in your track, which means you can boost the overall volume of it or cause a much different effect. So I have a pretty drastic amount of compression now, and what I'm going to do is show you how the attack works. So if I make this essentially 0, you should notice that these lines here are essentially almost perfectly vertical lines. Let me make this even more drastic. See, it's almost perfectly straight. Now if I make it like 200 milliseconds, see how it's no longer perfectly straight. It's much more of, instead of being like a sharp dive down to compressing, it kind of leans into it. So let's make this drastic again, do about 5 milliseconds. I'm going to do the same thing for a release so you can see what happens. Now if I do a really fast release, let me make, to see the release I need to make sure that the waveform dips below the threshold value. So I have a really fast release, and this is how fast it settles back down to no compression. If I make this really long, see how much longer it takes? Do the quick release. It's like almost instantly. So the effect that release will have is that, let's say you have a bass drum that you're trying to compress. You set a really long release time. If you want to hear the act of your compressor activating on every hit of your bass drum, if you have a really long release, by the time your next bass drum hits, your compressor may not have fully reset to 0. And you can use this to your advantage or disadvantage in certain ways if you know or don't know what you're doing. So I'm not going to go over all the ways in which you can use a compressor, but that is, the motivation behind why you actually need this parameter. So the last parameter that's common is, aside from input gain, which sets the input level that you can scale, the output gain, which you can scale. It's kind of like the makeup, but it's not the same thing as the makeup. Is the knee. So if you see this kind of point at which the slope changes on this, what is this, input versus output plot, is that you can make this perfectly sharp, which is a knee of 0, or you can make it pretty rounded, which is a knee of 1. So that's really all it is that it's how round that transition is. And honestly, I just leave it to the default. I wouldn't worry too much about this setting. If you can even hear the effect of it, you're probably dealing with some very, very, very minor and particular things. You're not worrying about how to use a compressor. So don't worry about it too much. There is some other settings like auto gain, which you can play with if you need to. Sometimes there's different views. These actually do model different things. So you can see how different compressors kind of look. This one doesn't have a knee. This one doesn't have an attack and release. This one just looks different, looks different, looks different. And I don't know if those are modeled off of analog gear, so they behave differently or not. But this is just a logic one. There's thousands of compressors online that you can use. And there's also such thing as side chaining, which you can use the compression from this audio to compress another track, which we'll get into in a future video, and I'll link down in the description when I do. So anyways, I think that's a pretty good place to stop for this video. I hope that answered any basic questions you have about compression, what the different parameters are, how it works, and what you can do to use it in your favor. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like. Consider subscribing for more. I upload videos every single Friday. Head over to DeNeraStudios.com for more bloggy type things, or to check out my products, and also music as well. And thanks for watching. See you later. Bye.